Hi everyone, here we are. It's the last video of 2023. It's the paper 3 preparation video. This one is different to the other paper 1 and 2 preparation videos because this one is specifically tailored to this year's exam. So I've waited until now to record it because you want to see both paper 1 and paper 2 before you record the paper 3 video. You might get a few hints about what probably more likely might not be covered. So let's get into it. This paper is different for a few reasons. Paper 1 and Paper 2 are exactly the same in terms of structure. Paper 3 is different, and there's a few reasons for that. The first is that instead of having 4 markers, you've got an 8 marker on each section instead. So the same in terms of 2 sections, 2 hours, 100 marks. You still want to think of it as 2 separate papers. You still want to be trying to make sure you get each section done within an hour. But there's an 8 marker instead of the 2 4 markers, and that does mean that timing is a bit tighter on Paper 3 because the 8 marker, certainly in my opinion, takes longer than 2 4 markers. In fact, actually, I'm of the opinion that an 8 marker takes potentially just as long, if not longer, than a 12 marker. So let's go through how to structure the 8 markers. We'll also go through the 10, 12, and 20 as well, though they've been covered in the other videos. So if you've been watching Paper 1 and Paper 2, you'll have a bit of an idea on those. 8 mark question is 2 peach paragraphs. There's no way around that. There's no way of making it quicker. There's no way of shortening that down. The questions say assess 2, and so you need to assess 2, but they also give you evaluation marks, and therefore you need to have that balance. So you need to have the howevers. So you kind of can't avoid that. The only thing I would say, I guess, is you maybe don't need to put quite as much depth in your howevers because you've got 2 of them, you've got 2 big paragraphs, and yeah, there's not a great deal of emphasis on the evaluation side. You just need to have balance. No conclusion or anything like that, just 1 peach paragraph for each of the 2, whatever it is, 2 factors, 2 benefits, whatever that could be. 10 and 12 markers, 1 peach paragraph and then a conclusion. Make sure that, however, balances your main point. You're on Paper 3. Hopefully you should know that stuff by now. And then the 20 marker, for and against option 1, for and against option 2. Do peach paragraphs for each of those, and then the conclusion as well. And we'll talk about the 20 marker towards kind of the end of this video, but one thing that's worth bearing in mind is there is no calculation question on this paper. There's no calculation for marker, I should say. So the quantitative skills will be assessed in one potentially more of the essay questions. And so the last section of this video talks about what that might be, what that could look like. It could be any of the quantitative skills, but I've got a few potential ideas that I think maybe link to the car market a little bit more, and so maybe those might be better shouts. Okay, so Paper 3, this is the other big difference. We've talked about how there's 8 markers instead of 4 markers. What you may be aware of is that the Paper 1 and Paper 2 are actually worth more of the entire qualification. They're worth 35% each, whereas this is worth 30% each. So effectively, the papers 1 and Paper 2, each mark on that is effectively worth 1.175 marks. This is straight 30%, so this is just 100 marks for 100 UMS. The other difference is that this provides a pre-release. So we've known since November or so that the exam for Paper 3 would be on the car market. So you might have done some activities on this, you might have done some research. We did a bit. We didn't do a great deal of research, we did a few bits of research. But then for the most part, what we've done is we've used the car market in case studies when we've looked at exam questions just to try and get our awareness that way. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to go through these bullet points, these 6 bullet points, and we're going to talk about which topics these might suggest could potentially come up, but also just some information about the car market. Now, there are some clues as to what potentially could come up in these bullet points, and I'm never going to make clear predictions to say this definitely will come up because I don't know what's going to come up. I haven't seen the paper, obviously. But there are a few things that you would think make a bit of sense to be assessed based around the fact this is about the car industry. So we're going to go through some context. We're going to go through some of these bullet points. And hopefully that will give you a little bit of a helping hand. You can't take any research into the exam. You don't need to, in theory, do any research because you will get given case studies in the exam papers. And so you can apply in the same way you normally could. But the more you know about the market, the easier this paper is going to be. So hopefully this video gives you a bit of an insight into the car market and into kind of how the car market works. So we're going to start with the first bullet point, which is current trends in the UK car market. We're going to start with prices. So there's a few factors that affect prices. If you look at the graph on the right hand side of the screen, you'll see that new car prices since about 2001, or well, actually probably since about 2004, have increased at maybe an average of about 2% per year. What you've also potentially noticed is that since 2018, that price increase has been up a little bit higher. And there's a few factors that will affect the price of a car, the price of a new car. These are the costs first and foremost, so the component costs, the supply of components. We will talk about the supply of components in a later bullet point. Labor costs is a big factor. Brand power, loyalty. Obviously, some car brands are really kind of highly differentiated, high luxury kind of cars, and so their price will be determined by their brand and the loyalty to those brands. And also their features, whether these cars have unique selling points, whether that's through design, whether that's through performance. There's a variety of factors, but that might potentially impact on the price that they set. But there are a few other little kind of changes to pricing in the car market that I think are worth being aware of. And the first is this concept of microtransactions. So effectively, a microtransaction is an add-on for a car, which sounds wild, but anyone who plays computer games will be familiar with this sensation where you kind of spend 70 quid on a computer game, and then when you get it, you realize that if you want to unlock certain sort of areas, you have to pay additional, and you're thinking, well, what was the point in paying the 70 quid in the first place? So Mercedes has done this. They were one of the most prominent kind of early adopters of this, where they were charging people $1,200 to just kind of fine tune the engine. And obviously the key thing with this is all of this stuff is software based. You don't need to take your car into the garage to get any of these things fitted. These are things that the engine, like the computer on board the car, is deciding to turn off until you pay to turn it on. So it's not like the car isn't capable of this performance and it needs a tune-up. They just need to change some settings. So I guess this is now, I mean, there's no other way to say this other than it's businesses' desires to just bleed more money out of people. So that article up there, microtransaction hell intensifies as Mercedes turn improved car acceleration into a subscription where you'd pay that per year. That's from the PC Gamer. The bottom 4 screenshots are from my friend Matt, who has a Volkswagen. He's bought it very recently. I was in the car with him a couple of weeks ago on our way to the football, and Newcastle United, obviously. And he was telling me, it was the first time I'd been in his new car, and he was telling me about how you can pay for things. And so I sent him a text when I was putting this together, and I said, can you send me some screenshots? And he loaded up the app on his phone. And if you have a look at the second one from the right there, you can see upgrades for my vehicle. There's literally a shop in the settings, and you'll notice that light assist and the dynamic background lighting says from £0. That's because you can get a 1 month free trial. So if you have a look on the first screenshot, you'll see that is a 1 month free trial of £0 for voice control. But if you want to get that for the rest of the year, it's £199. And so each of these kind of add 200, 250, 300 quid on, depending on what the upgrade is. And so that's kind of like that microtransaction pricing strategy. I thought it was just worth mentioning that that's a thing. And I think they're kind of hoping that it becomes normal and people just accept it. And I mean, I'm certainly not buying a car that has add-ons, especially when a lot of these things could just be turned on with no extra cost to the business. Now, the consequences of price are that sometimes, and this is actually quite frequent and certainly more frequent than buying a car in upfront in cash, is not many people haven't got that kind of money, is people lease or finance cars as an alternative. So people might potentially, so there's 2 different versions of this. If you lease a car, then you pay a monthly fee, you get the car, and then at the end of that lease, you can either renew the lease or you can send that car back and get a new one. And there's no, at any point, ownership. If you decided to walk away from the lease, you'd be walking away from the car. This is in the same way that if you were renting a house, you wouldn't necessarily gain any ownership in that house. Once you left that house, you would just leave. But you pay to run the car. And bearing in mind how much people use cars, you could argue there's some value for money there. The alternative is to finance a car where basically you are effectively borrowing money to pay it over a period of time. So quite often with a car finance deal, you'll pay a deposit, and then you will pay a monthly fee for a monthly repayment of maybe a certain amount of money for 3 years, 4 years, depending on what the term is. And then at the end of the 3 years or 4 years, you can either pay what is left on the car balance to own the car, or you can refinance and maybe take the additional amount that you owe and refinance that over the next 2 years, or you can trade in the car that you've got for a newer car. So there's different ways of doing this, and that's one of the consequences of price. Of course, from a car dealership standpoint, they potentially could make more money on the interest if they do the finance themselves. So from a business's perspective, it's just worth being aware of kind of the pricing trends within the car market. Another factor that we've got to consider is customer tastes and preferences. So we're going to split this into a few little categories here. The first is just having an understanding of how many sales we see of cars. So it's been between 2 and 3 million. You can see this graph here. The sort of light blue green color is the left-hand y-axis, which shows the number of sales. This is from Car Sales Base. And then on the right-hand y-axis, that black line you can see is the growth. So if you look at where we see 0%, about just over halfway up, you can see any dots above that suggest that there's been a growth in car sales. There's been some predictable drops in car sales. So for example, well, in fact, actually it correlates perfectly with when we've had economic downturns. So for example, the 2008-2009 period, you'd see negative growth in cars because of the economic recession, which of course makes sense. When people were losing jobs, they weren't buying new cars. And then you can also see a little bit of a turn down after the Brexit vote because of some of the economic uncertainty around tariffs and imports, and a huge drop in 2020 because COVID. No one was going anywhere. So what's the point in buying a new car? It's not really the right time to do it. So we've seen those kind of those drops have been because of economic factors. So as I mentioned, we've got Brexit, we've got the exchange rate impact there when we import products, we've got the COVID impact. Now, what this has led to is this leads to quite a bit of uncertainty within the economy and cost, and it leads to consumers postponing their spending. So my car Madeline there is pictured on the screen. I've had my car for 8 years now, and every year for the last probably 3 or 4 years, I've thought about potentially upgrading. And then when I've looked at it and I've looked at the cost, and I've considered that I own my car, so all I have to pay for it is obviously the running cost and then repair costs, it was not cost effective for me to buy a new car. And I still love my car, so I was happy to stick with it. So that is consumer behavior. You know, when we talk about changes in consumer tastes and preferences, a lot of people have decided not to buy a new car because of the cost, and also because of uncertainty within the economy, because of COVID, because of Brexit, because of the 2008-2009 recession. There are some other parts to taste and preferences as well, such as what kinds of car people buy. Broadly, and there are more than this, but broadly you've got 3 kind of popular types of car body type. You've got the hatchback, which are kind of the smaller cars with the kind of the boot's it's on a hatch, so the whole boot kind of lifts up like the whole back panel of the car. You've got a saloon car, which has more of like a sticky out kind of back, and you've got the SUV. What we've seen quite a lot in the last few years is probably in the last maybe 20 years is the saloon cars have become less and less popular, and people have either gone for the small hatchback or the SUV. And what we've noticed maybe more recently in the last sort of 8 to 10 years, and especially in the last 5 years in terms of new cars coming out, is we've seen the growth of the crossover SUV. And the Nissan Qashqai is probably the big popularizing model that started that trend, where it's like an SUV, but it's not as big. It's like a typical kind of like Range Rover size cars. If you have a look at the size of Range Rovers from 2005 and compare them to the size of a Range Rover from 2023, you'll be shocked at how much bigger they were and how much kind of more boxy they were. So that's just a part of tastes changing. You have a look on the right hand side there, you've got the UK's best selling cars of 2023, and there's a mix in there between the kind of hatchback like the Puma, the Corsa, and then you've got the Qashqai and the Tucson from Hyundai. You've got like a mixture of the two there. So we can see that in terms of popularity, that's pretty much what's being bought. But in the list of headings in the research, it mentioned color specifically. And so I wanted to do a little bit of research on, like, if the fact that it mentioned color specifically makes me wonder if you could potentially get something that links to color. So all of these figures are from 2022. So grey, 25.7% of cars in the UK were grey. So that's the most popular color. Black 20%, white 16%, blue 16%, and then the others are a little bit more niche. So red, I've obviously got my car back on any excuse to have Madeline on the screen. My car's called Madeline after a song by a band called the Decemberists. My car's red. I quite like having a red car. You don't see too many of them around. 8.5% of them apparently are red. You've got silver, which is at 6.1%. But one interesting thing about silver is it's down 11.7%. So that's become much less popular. And then green has a really small share of this in 1.9%, but it's actually increased by 74% from the previous year. And there's a suggestion there that perhaps the rarer colours, not necessarily the rarer colours, the more unusual car colours, the more non-traditional car colours, are increasing quite significantly in popularity. And I just wonder if maybe the colour section there, I'm trying to figure out where that could link to the specification. And I think the most obvious potential point is the design mix. When you think about the aesthetics of the design mix when it comes to buying a car, aesthetics might be, certainly for some brands, will be one of the most important, if not the most important element of the design mix. So worth checking out the design mix. If you're not familiar with that model or you can't remember that model, worth having a look at that. Of course, it's probably a good idea at this point to just say that there's a recap video for every single part of the course now on the YouTube channel. It's been a busy few weeks. This is the last one I'm doing for a while, so I'm going to enjoy a nice little holiday after this. Well, I say a nice little holiday. I'm going to work tomorrow, obviously, but you know what I mean. So have a look at the design mix. That'll be in the 1.3 video. All of the links to those will be in the description to this video. We also need to take into consideration probably the biggest trend in the UK car market, and that is the growth of electric car sales. Now, there's a few reasons and factors behind this. The first and the most obvious is the environmental concern. So that links nicely to the Pestle analysis. Pestle came up as the 20 marker in paper 2. And so I don't know how on the nose it's going to be about a Pestle question specifically, but you can't ignore electric cars. There's got to be something about electric cars in this. It's such a big trend within the market. It's the big trend within the market. And this is because this environmental concern is because transport accounts for about 23% of global emissions. And by having an electric vehicle, you are reducing the emissions from the exhaust because electric vehicles don't have exhausts. Now, there's two types of electric vehicle. You've got a hybrid and you've got a pure electric. So a hybrid has both a kind of traditional combustion engine and a battery, whereas the pure electric cars are just the battery. There's a huge range of arguments as to which one's better. The environmental ones are definitely, in terms of the environment side, better, the electric ones, but the hybrid ones do provide a little bit of extra range for someone who maybe can't get to where they typically travel just on the battery range. Now, there are some critics that argue that actually making and the production of an EV car and the batteries actually creates more emissions in production than creating a petrol car. One such critic is Mr. Bean, or Rowan Atkinson, as he's known in real life. Rowan Atkinson, by the way, is a Geordie. I just like mention that anytime Mr. Bean comes up. Now, he's correct in one sense. He is correct that in terms of the actual production of the car, it is actually, you do create more greenhouse emissions in producing an EV car and a battery than you do if you create a petrol car. But obviously, of course, over the long term, that would be balanced out by the fact that the running environmental impact will be much lower. Now, we've also seen, linking to Pestle, a lot of government intervention on this. The UK have announced, I think a couple of years ago, that they were going to ban the sales of new petrol and diesel cars. In 2020, they announced this. They were going to try, I think it was either 2019 or 2020 they announced this. And the goal was to do this by 2030. Now, as a result of that, you would expect to see a sudden increase in the amount of people buying electric cars because they're starting to future-proof. And in 2022, EV sales were second behind petrol, which meant that electric vehicle sales overtook diesel for the first time. And actually, only a couple of months ago, in January of this year, EV sales overtook petrol for the first time. So that was the first time we've had a month where electric vehicles sold more than petrol. And so if that trend continues for the next 7 years, then that's really quite significant. Now, there are some factors to consider here. The first is the car cost. Now, an electric vehicle is more expensive up front, but the running costs are cheaper in the long run. So, an equivalent of a hatchback for an electric one, unless you're buying one of the, Nissan have been doing this for such a long period of time that the Nissan Leaf is actually quite affordable because they've been able to develop, economies of scale through their production. But a lot of them are really, really expensive. If you looked at like a Mercedes or a Volvo and you want to buy the electric version, you'd pay more for it. So the car cost is a factor to consider when it comes to the growth of electric vehicles. It's one of the factors for myself. I'd love to get an electric car. So we have two cars. We've got Madeline that I've shown in the photos earlier. We've got a Nissan Leaf. My fiance, my wife to be, has got a Nissan Leaf, and it's a brilliant car, really nice drive. But I drive from Suffolk to Newcastle every couple of weeks to go to the football or to visit family, and so I would have to stop and charge twice, and that's a factor for me. We'll touch on that in a second. And so that and the fact that they're more expensive are the two things that have stopped me from buying one so far. That and the wedding I'm trying to pay for. There's also and this is really, really important, ethically and environmentally minded consumers. There's a growing trend among people who are conscious of the environment, people who are conscious about being ethical, and that is influencing decisions. So that was the factor for my wife to be. She's a science teacher, so she's obviously very environmentally conscious, and so she was really keen to get an electric car. I have the same opinion. I'm just waiting for the point where I find one that I think is good value for money, and I'm willing to make that payment. And I'm willing to part with Madeline, of course, as well. If you haven't picked up on it from the last 5 minutes, I really do like my car. There's also income factors. Changes in income will have a massive impact on purchasing choices because you don't need to buy a new car. There's plenty of other options. You can get a second-hand car and what have you. There are alternatives we'll talk about in a little while. So economic factors, you've seen that with the data we looked at earlier, where when there were economic concerns, sales of cars dropped. Infrastructure is a really big factor. Charging point availability. I remember when I read about the plan to create a bunch of I remember when I read about the plan to ban the petrol and diesel car sales, and I thought to myself, okay, so over the next couple of years, we should see a huge investment from government and from companies that run petrol stations to start building up their charging point availability. And I think we're only now starting to see that. So it's taken us a few years, but it typically does take us a few years to kind of realize we need to do something. We are quite reactive. And now we're starting to see that. Certainly, if you go to a service station on a motorway, there's quite a lot of investment into service stations to convert kinds of parts of their car park into electric vehicle places. There's a company called Fastned that have set up a bunch of charging stations. There's one near where we are in Ipswich, where it's effectively kind of like a petrol station, but specifically for electric cars with charging ports. I've driven to London and found a car park that had an entire floor of electric charging points that you could then hire for the day. And then energy prices is a factor as well. Long term, it's hopefully not going to be a factor because energy prices are hopefully about to go back down. But when you think about the charging and the running costs of these cars, a lot of the benefit of the cheap kind of charging, because you'd use your electricity at home if you were home charging, a lot of the benefit of that has been taken away by the fact that that energy prices have gone up so much. And so that's also a factor to consider. So let's look at the market overall. And when you think about the competitive environment, there's one model that stands out, and that's Porter's 5 forces. If you're gonna analyze a market, this is probably the best place to start. And so I've done a brief kind of Porter's 5 forces analysis of the UK car market. So the 5 forces are these 5 that you can see on the screen. So the rivalry amongst existing competitors, the threat of new entrants, the threat of substitutes, the bargaining power of buyers and suppliers. And so I had to think about kind of how many of these factors and how much of these factors affect the market for and the competitive environment that these car industry businesses face. Now, I've done this from the perspective of car manufacturers. It also mentions car dealers and car servicing businesses. We'll talk about them in the next bit. So let's start with rivalry amongst competitors. This has increased quite a bit over the last 40 years, mainly because of the globalization of the market. The ease of travel and communication in terms of bringing foreign cars into Europe, especially on the cost leadership side of the market, because of cost advantages that foreign production and certainly in Asia has on Europe. And that competition is very much split between the high side of the market, so that you've got luxury brands that will compete between themselves, and you've got the low cost leadership brands that will compete amongst themselves. So there's two kind of UK car markets really. There's the luxury, and then there's the kind of more kind of cost competitive. The threat of new entrants, it is quite difficult to join this market. It's expensive. There's a high capital investment needed. You're going to have to set up production facilities, distribution facilities. And of course, standards are really, really high. And so you have to establish kind of quality, safety, reliability, durability. And so it can take quite a long time to build a new car brand. Now, the biggest threat of new entrants is not necessarily from brand new startups, it's from existing tech companies who are diversifying into electric vehicles. So we've seen quite a bit in the news about Google and their self-driving electric cars. We've seen it from Apple as well. I think if you're going to see new entrants to the market, it's going to be existing firms that have the capital to be able to invest in this and think that it's potentially profitable. That's probably what you're more likely to see. And so that's something just worth thinking about. But, you know, for us, one of us to start a car manufacturing firm, it's quite unlikely. In terms of the threat of substitutes, I'm not doing these in round order. I'm doing these in like the order that I think makes logical sense in terms of like the narrative. The threat of substitutes, there are substitutes. You can get public transport. If it's a short haul, you can ride a bike. As car costs increase, there's been a little bit more of a focus on, you know, from people on using public transport. Of course, public transport isn't necessarily cheap either. And so that's also a factor. In terms of buyer bargaining power, in theory, buyers, consumers have quite a lot of power because there are a lot of choices. If you go to a dealership and you don't like the price that they've quoted or what have you, you can go to a different dealer, you know, depending on what kind of brand loyalty you have and depending on whether you're okay with going to a different brand or a different type of car. The power, though, is with the dealerships rather than the manufacturers. You don't really have any kind of power over the manufacturers other than, you know, a giant collection of consumers deciding not to buy a product for a particular reason might influence their decisions. So that power is more of a dealerships than manufacturers, but still worth being aware of that. Consumers are quite likely to shop around, maybe even within one brand. For example, you can use businesses like CarWow to compare the prices that are offered in dealerships. We did this when we bought last July, when we bought the Nissan Leaf. The deal that we got, we found a Nissan dealership, I think it was in like Sheffield or something like that, that offered this deal, this sort of slightly cheap price. We went to the one in Ipswich and we said, we found this price elsewhere. Will you match it? They did. So you have a bit of power in terms of bargaining just like that as well. In terms of supplier bargaining power, manufacturers tend to rely quite heavily on their suppliers. They don't typically produce all of their own parts. And if you decided as a car manufacturer that you want to change who supplies some of your parts, there's a huge amount of cost involved with that. Not only finding a supplier that can provide and supply those parts, but also having to potentially redesign products can be quite expensive. Also, it affects the repair market as well, which can have an impact. And so that means that suppliers have a fair amount of power. There's also quite a lack of supply for certain parts as well. We're going to talk about this again in a moment. I said we'd talk about supply of parts. We will touch on that again later on. But the fact that there is sometimes quite a lack of supply for parts or components and there's high sales quantities, that gives the suppliers a fair bit of power. So that's Porter's 5 forces. That hopefully gives you a bit of an idea about how the car market kind of works. Let's talk about the different types of businesses that you might see in terms of case studies here. The first is car manufacturers. These typically are large multinational corporations. They will benefit from large levels of economies of scale because of their production quantities. Many of them are multinational corporations that own several brands. So you look at the graphic on the right-hand side. I think that's slightly outdated now, but it gives the story pretty well. A lot of these brands, and I think sometimes you probably don't even realize that some of these brands are owned by the same company. So like, how many people know that? Obviously, we know Volkswagen. Do we know that the company that owns Volkswagen also owns Lamborghini, Porsche, Bentley, Bugatti, and Skoda? You know, there's a range there. And so the fact that these businesses are only owned by maybe 14 companies, there's more to it than this, of course, gives these businesses quite a lot of power. So we talked quite a lot about car manufacturers already, so I'm going to move on to a different kind of stage in this. Let's talk about car dealers. One thing that I think is quite important to be aware of when it comes to car dealers is the ownership type. A lot of car dealers are dealership franchises, and so it's worth making sure we're aware of what a franchise is and what a dealership franchise is. A dealership franchise is where a private company is given the right to sell a manufacturer's brand and cars. So, for example, there's the one nearest to where we work or where we go to school is Endeavour Hyundai. And so Endeavour is the company, and they have an agreement with Hyundai to basically sell and distribute their cars. You'll see a bunch of those. Thurlow Nunn is another one in this local area. There's a Thurlow Nunn Vauxhall. There's a few of these all over the place. They're getting free advertising from these videos, of course. We should try and get some sponsors for next year, maybe. So that's something that's worth being aware of. And I guess the other thing that's really important here is that means that if you have a relationship as a dealer with customers, trying to get customer loyalty and repeat customers is really, really important, especially when it comes to those finance agreements. You want people to be signing on for those finance agreements for years and years and years. And you want them to be getting their next car with you as well. So there's a real importance in terms of customer service there that I think is worth bearing in mind. Now, in terms of car servicing businesses, these are often independently owned small businesses, and they typically will deal with local competition. Their competition is going to be other independently owned small businesses or larger dealer garages that are attached to the dealerships we've just mentioned. So, for example, there's a fella who I see in the gym every morning who works at the garage at Jaguar Land Rover. And so Jaguar Land Rover are a dealership, but they also have their own garage. And so they kind of deal with some of that in-house. Whereas there are a lot of independent garages that are just owned by potentially, just family businesses and what have you. So I think one thing that's really interesting here is that these three types of businesses, these three sort of mini industries really, manufacturers, dealerships and car services, they all differ quite significantly in scale. And I just think that's important. I think that's interesting. One thing I think is really important with both the dealers and the car servicing is if you think about the relationships that they have to have with customers and to try and gain that customer loyalty. And therefore, there's a bit about human resources coming up. The bit about human resources, that's a bullet point every single year because it means that they can ask questions about human resources and managing people. But with this one, I just think clearly staff in these smaller businesses, car servicing and car dealerships are really, really important. And so the importance of staff, that could be like a recruitment selection training question. It could be an approaches to staffing question, anything like that. Just worth bearing in mind. So before we move on to human resources, let's talk about resource management. The first is stock control. So let's think about stock control and kind of, I guess the main thing I'm thinking about here is lean production, the concept of lean production. Now, Toyota are a perfect example of this. Toyota are going to get mentioned again in the next little section. But Toyota have this kind of production system. They're famous for it. They're a lot of the models that we're going to talk about in terms of managing resources and quality are based around Toyota's kind of principles. And one of them is the Toyota production system. And this is all about reducing waste. It's all about trying to get as peak efficiency as you possibly can. And there's two concepts that form this. We've got just-in-time management of stock, which we hopefully are aware of. It's in the 2.4 video, if not. And there's also this Judoka, which is basically a system where when they have their kind of production processes and when there's a problem that occurs, production immediately stops and they try and fix it. And they do this because they don't want any defective products being continued. They don't want to waste any materials on defective products. They want to identify these as quick as possible. They want to fix them and they want to move on. And hopefully they may even be able to develop fixes and improvements based around that. So that Toyota production system is incredibly important, and it's all based around this concept of lean production, trying to eliminate waste in all manners as often as they possibly can. I mentioned earlier supply chain management, and this is where I kind of want to come back to this. They had a huge amount of problems. A lot of car industry businesses had a lot of problems during COVID, particularly trying to source microchips, and that meant that it took a lot. First of all, it meant costs were going up for businesses, but it also meant that the lead times for cars and new cars have been as high as something like 18 months, whereas in the past, kind of before this, you might have waited 2 to 3 months for a car. I searched up on this just today about average kind of wait times, and you're looking at like 36 weeks. So while it's got a little bit better, it's still a problem. And so they're expecting supply chain relief to come, but not within the next year. And so that has a huge impact in terms of what manufacturers are able to produce, but also on how quickly we're able to buy new cars if we want them. And that was one of the contributing factors to used cars becoming more and more popular. Let's talk about the production process in a little bit more detail. So car manufacturing typically uses a lot of cell production. Workers specialize, they'll have their own cell, they'll do their own thing, then they'll pass the car along the kind of production line. And in terms of quality, it's just worth bearing in mind. Look, I think quality was one of the topics I thought might come up this year because it's not been assessed a huge amount over the last few years. And so it hasn't come up super explicitly so far. And this, with the amount of production in car manufacturing, it seems like an obvious time to ask a question. Doesn't mean there's going to be one, but it seems like it would fit with the theme. Quality control is where we check our quality at the end of production. Quality assurance is where we check quality throughout production, and that has obviously an obvious benefit there of potentially identifying faults earlier. But what it does mean is it does mean that production takes longer. And then we've got these two models, TQM, total quality management, and this is where, rather than it just being one person's job to be the quality control person, it's everyone's job within the organization. It's part of the culture of the organization that quality is embedded, and a focus on improving quality is embedded. Businesses, everyone within the organization is responsible for trying to improve the quality of the products. Whether you're directly involved in that particular piece of building the car, or whether you're involved in a different part, you're involved in improving quality. And then Kaizen as well, this attitude of continuous improvement, that concept of always looking to try and make those 1 or 2% improvements. These two models, that TQM and Kaizen, they were, pushed through and really exemplified by Toyota and certainly like the Japanese car makers. And so again, you think about what potentially the case studies could be. And if you were thinking about, I would potentially expect that maybe one of them is going to be a little bit more, maybe a market-based one. So maybe like a particular geographical region. But if you're thinking about businesses in particular that could come up, Toyota comes up so often in my teaching that Toyota would be an obvious candidate. We'll talk about another obvious candidate a little bit later. So yeah, I mean, maybe there'll be something on Toyota, in which case that quality link could be really, really impactful. Managing people in the car industry. Labor productivity is another obvious one, but it also came up in paper 2 and maybe isn't quite as likely, but it's certainly worth considering. So thinking about the productivity of car factories. Recruitment and selection and training, we've already talked about why staff are important, and so I just think it's worth re-emphasizing that as well, especially in those dealerships and those servicing businesses where customer service and customer retention and customer loyalty and the levels of customer service are incredibly important, and also post-sales service as well. After the transaction has been made, there's going to be, cars don't last forever, cars break down, cars have problems, and so that after-sales care could be really important. So in manufacturing, it's mostly capital intensive, so maybe it's not as important, but in dealerships, they're likely to be the main selling agents, and so it's really important that they're able to encourage sales, but also help support customers after sales. In servicing, they have to provide that good customer service to gain loyalty, especially these independent businesses. They need that customer retention. They need those positive relationships. So I think staff and the importance of staff and the importance of high quality staff is a really important theme to be thinking about in dealerships and servicing. In terms of motivation and leadership, motivation theory was in paper 1 in a 20 marker. And so I think maybe that's unlikely that you'd see that again. But you could see, in terms of dealing with human resources, financial and non-financial motivators, in particular commission. Every year when I teach commission, the example I always go to is car dealerships, where you get a lower base salary, but you will get a percentage of the sale, or you'll get a bonus per sale. In terms of non-financial motivators, things like job enrichment, job rotation, potentially could be factors to consider. And in terms of leadership styles, we're going to talk about entrepreneurs in a minute. Leadership styles could link to entrepreneurs. So just a reminder of those 4 leadership styles. Autocratic, leaders in charge, they make all the decisions. Democratic, they make decisions but consult with staff. Paternalism, they'll make decisions based around employee benefit. And then laissez-faire, which is the more kind of laid back approach. You wouldn't see as much laissez-faire. The only place you'd probably see any laissez-faire really is in potentially in a dealership. If they were, if you've employed a really good salesperson, you might give them the kind of freedom to employ their sales tactics. If it's research and development for the car brands, you might see a bit of creativity in that sense, but you're not going to see that on a factory line or anything like that. And in fact, actually, quite often you'll see a lot of autocratic leaders within these organizations. Which leads us very nicely to this next example. I mentioned Toyota as potentially an area that could come up as a case study. Well, when you think about car entrepreneurs and leaders in the UK car market, it was mentioned. And when you think about entrepreneurs in the car market, there's one person who stands out above anyone else, and that's Elon Musk. He is the most prominent entrepreneur. He's one of the most prominent entrepreneurs in the world, not just in the car market. his business obviously being Tesla. And so if you go back to 1.5, and there's a 1.5 video that I would strongly recommend having a look at, because there's some specific bits in there that could quite easily come up. The fact that entrepreneurs and leaders are mentioned, it's just a suggestion that there's going to be a question about a particular entrepreneur. If it's Elon Musk, brilliant. If it's not, that's absolutely fine, because this stuff can apply to any of these leaders. You just have to find what it is that they've done. So think about what makes an entrepreneur and what an entrepreneur has to do. So if we think about roles and characteristics, the roles: creating a business, generating ideas, leading the growth of the business, and the characteristics like risk-taking, communication, creativity, having a vision. All of those things are really, really important. And hopefully you'd be able to see in a case study, if there was an entrepreneur, it seems like there has to be an entrepreneur mentioned in a case study. I don't know who, but it seems like that's going to have to be mentioned, given that entrepreneurs and leaders are mentioned here. Look at what they've done. Look at the decisions they've made. Look at how they've demonstrated certain attributes, because you could quite easily get a question like an 8 marker, for example, assess 2 characteristics, or assess 2 roles of an entrepreneur, or something like that. Another point in that unit in 1.5, which is the last topic in 1.5, is moving from an entrepreneur to a leader. Now, Elon Musk has started numerous businesses, and he's often been starting with small businesses, and then they've got bigger and bigger and bigger. And actually, if you look at the most recent history, you look at, he's been with Zip2, X.com, SpaceX, PayPal. He was an early investor in Tesla. He's been the chairman, the CEO for the last 15 years. He's also now in charge of Twitter. The businesses have grown quite a lot, and he's become incredibly rich. He's obviously a brilliant entrepreneur in so many ways, but I think it's fair to say that as these businesses have become so much bigger, certainly in the last sort of 6 years or so, it hasn't necessarily gone very well. The way he's managed his staff and the way he's kind of managed the leadership teams he surrounds himself with hasn't necessarily been his most effective kind of actions. He's obviously a fantastic inventor. He's obviously a fantastic kind of visionary. In terms of him as a leader, Elon Musk is worth a hell of a lot more money than I am. I don't think Elon Musk is going to take it personally offended that a business teacher from England said that his leadership skills weren't that great. Like, he's a very, very, very successful man, and his family for generations and generations will do really, really well. So I'm sure he's not going to be upset at me saying this, but he's made a bit of a mess of Twitter, and he's also not necessarily done a fantastic job with Tesla. A lot of the Tesla shareholders are a bit concerned that his attention is elsewhere. And when you go from being an entrepreneur where you're in charge to having to be a leader and having to manage other people and manage other people's priorities, there's a big challenge there. And I just, that could potentially apply to Elon Musk. He's the best example because he's the most prominent one, but that could apply to any entrepreneur who starts a car business, who finds it difficult when they move from an entrepreneur to a leader. We've seen a past example question about that before. And so it's just, worth something worth considering. So I would be looking at the entirety of 1.5. Entrepreneurs and leaders is mentioned in this list of bullet points. And so you got 8 questions. What's the chances that one of them is going to be about that? Maybe we'll find out next Wednesday. In terms of global and external influences, we've got labor costs globally. And so different countries have different labor costs. So choosing a production location, that's come up already in, I think it was in paper 1. And so maybe that's not going to be the focus here, but it's worth just mentioning that if you think about the minimum wage in certain countries in US dollars, you can see there how much cheaper it is to produce cars in certain areas. I was shocked at how low the minimum wage is in the USA, by the way, but then actually, was I shocked? Like, the more I read about the USA, the less anything kind of surprises me, really. But China and India are really, really low minimum wage rates, and so factory workers will get paid a lot less money, and so they maybe have cost competitive advantages when it comes to producing their cars. So it could be choosing a production location based around that, but again, I think that's come up already this year, so I wouldn't necessarily expect that to come up again, although, hey, you could ask the same topic twice on 2 different papers. Potentially worth thinking about trading blocks, maybe being based around a location within a trading block to avoid tariffs and quotas. That's something that's definitely worth having a look at. Now, linking to that, let's talk about protectionism and let's talk about trading blocks. Protectionism is, whenever I teach protectionism, I always use the American car market as an example. And not necessarily just because this year it was the car market, that was the UK car market, that was the case study. And I know that the case study says the UK car market, but this is about global and external influences. So the USA is a perfect example of protectionism. They have imposed a ton of restrictions to try and disincentivize imports and therefore encourage domestic production. This was definitely the most, I guess, clearly understood concept and policy that Donald Trump brought to the American politics. And it's not necessarily been walked all the way back by Joe Biden either. They are trying to protect jobs in the US car market. And one way to do that is make it difficult or make it more expensive for your consumers to buy foreign replacements. But the one disadvantage, one of the disadvantages of protectionism is it does promote inefficiency in domestic businesses, because you're effectively giving the domestic businesses a price advantage, and therefore potentially you could argue removing the incentive for them to innovate. So protectionism is something that's worth bearing in mind. Make sure you know what protectionism is. And then trading blocks. Just because this is the opposite of protectionism, being in a trading block promotes trade. It removes tariffs and quotas. And so if a country joins a trading block, they'll be able to import cars at no tariff cost. Especially important for countries that are in the same trading block as prominent car manufacturers. Again, if there's something about trading blocks, you'd see it in the case study. So you'd be looking at specific businesses in specific countries there, but something that's just worth watching out for. Now, global competitiveness. We've seen some Asian car brands make the leap into the global market, but not all, and that's something that's worth bearing in mind. We see a lot of global businesses within this market, but there are still some regional manufacturers that haven't quite made it globally. The Asian market's one to be particularly aware of, in particular China. If we look at some of the statistics here, if you look from 2005 to 2022, the percentage of households that own a car has just absolutely shot up. India's increased as well, but by nowhere near as much. The USA has very slightly increased. It's gone kind of up and down over the last sort of 15 years. But that's a low growth market. The most people in the USA already have cars, whereas China, there's still a huge amount of the population who haven't. In terms of annual sales, you can see that reflected there, especially in China, where you can see that from 2005, 3.97 million to 2022, 23 million. And USA, you can see there, has actually dropped a little bit since 2005. So, yeah, some factors worth considering. The growing markets are the Asian markets and what have you, and some of the more established kind of economic markets are actually fairly low growth in terms of sales. And how do we adapt our cars for different markets? There's a few factors that are worth considering here. One is, first of all, different cars have different legal requirements. Left-hand drive versus right-hand drive. Doing that increases the cost for businesses. They have to change the adaptation. They have to adapt their design. They are going to have to spend more in terms of their production costs to do that. We've also got size preferences as well by different countries. So America loves a massive truck. We went to America last year. I went to Vegas and we hired a car and we did the road trip from Vegas to the Grand Canyon. And one of the things I was most excited about was hiring like a big old American kind of, I wanted either a Ford Mustang or a big old kind of 4x4. And we went with the 4x4 because there were three of us and I didn't think we'd be able to get my mate Dave and all of our luggage in the back of a Mustang. And so we drove around in these huge cars and you feel like you're kind of sitting really high up and you feel kind of big and powerful, which probably explains why the Americans love those so much. In other countries, you have much smaller cars because of the size of their roads and things like that. So there are preferences that mean that cars are typically adapted quite kind of like more like geocentric approach. Again, we've had ethnocentric and polycentric and geocentric in paper 1 as well, so maybe that's not going to be mentioned quite so explicitly in paper 3. This all increases the unit cost of production, which is significant when it comes to adapting for the different markets. So that's what I think is worth bearing in mind. They also have to abide by different legislation requirements in different areas, which is of course also potentially going to increase costs if they have to redesign their products. And then that kind of covers the bullet points. The last thing I want to say really is that there's going to be I mentioned this at the very top of the video, there's going to be a quantitative skill element needed for at least one of these questions. And so here are some potential areas that could come from. So some things to worth bearing in mind. It could be a model, it could be a decision tree, it could be a critical path analysis, it could be investment appraisal. And if that was the case, that would probably all likely be focused around a project or an investment from the business. Investment appraisal was the 20 marker last year, so I'd be surprised to see that again, but it could happen, so make sure you're prepared for it. Decision trees haven't been seen for a while. Critical paths only come twice in 6 years. So they're both potentially possible, but not necessarily the only option. It could be financial, such as ratio analysis. Maybe a company, you might see some financial statements. You might have to assess the profitability and liquidity. That's definitely possible. Or it could be something more kind of conceptual. So, for example, price or income elasticity. Price and income elasticity is incredibly relevant to the car market. Car demand is like, depending on the car and depending on the type of product, whether it's kind of luxury, whether it's more like of a normal good, can be really reactive to changes in terms of price and income. And so that could be potentially something to think about if you get something about price or income elasticity. Whether it asks you to calculate anything, I'm not sure. Whether it could just be interpreting data, but something that's just well worth being aware of. Capacity utilization as well. Capacity utilization came up a bunch of times last year. It's come up quite a lot recently. And but that could be used if the focus is on a particular business's production. And so there's a few things that are worth kind of considering there as potential models. Of course, it could be any of the other models on the course, any of the other kind of quantitative skills, but those were the ones that I thought made the most sense to this market. So please don't hate me if the one that it is isn't on that list. But what do you need to do? You need to make sure you know your finances. You need to make sure you know to expect that there's going to be a calculation-based question, and it's going to be an essay. And when you see these, usually once you've done the calculation or you've interpreted the data, that's going to form the basis for most of your application. There may be paragraphs that go alongside that as well. If it's a 20 marker, you might find that one of the sections comes from the data and the other option is based around application from a paragraph. You'll know which question it is because the question will say using the data and extract whatever. And so that'll prompt you to look at the data. It is tight timing wise. Look, if you've got to do some calculations before you start even writing the essay, yeah, that's going to affect the level of quantity that you can write in the essay. And so I guess what I would say is do your calculations because you need to do them, interpret the data because you need to do it. Don't worry if your points aren't quite as long and in depth. Timing is incredibly important. And the last thing you want to do is spend half an hour doing one of those questions and then find that you run out of time for an 8 marker, because you might be better off getting, 5 or 6 out of 8 versus writing an extra few lines for that, an extra paragraph for that 20 marker, which might only get you another extra 2 or 3 marks. So hopefully that's helped for paper 3. Hopefully this will help you get through. If you've watched all the videos over the last few weeks, then thank you very much for the support. Thanks for all of the lovely and sometimes funny comments. Hopefully the exams have gone well. Hopefully these videos have been really, really helpful. If you've got any questions about paper 3 stuff, I can't pretend that I'm an expert on the car market. I've specifically done this research for this video, so I'm not some sort of like car oracle, but I will certainly try and find some answers if you've got any specific questions. Good luck in the exam, and good luck for results day in August, and then good luck with whatever you're doing next. And I will see you around.